Who do you want by your side when you go diving? A close friend? The best dive buddy available? Perhaps a guardian angel? There's someone who can be all of these things. Dan has been helping divers since 1983, when a group of passionate divers started an international non-profit medical and research organization dedicated to the health and safety of the global diving community. Where can I find Dan, you ask? Well, all over the world. Dan is an advocate for a more alert diving community and provides you with assistance every step of the way for all kinds of divers and their families. Because although we as divers want to discover the unknown, we should never do so unprotected or uninformed. That's why it's good to have someone providing you with emergency medical assistance, promoting diving safety, and sharing vital diving research with you. Sometimes we all need someone to guide and protect us. When it comes to diving, that someone is Dan.
All right, so time for another Dan Southern Africa webinar. While we wait for more folks to join, I'll get the formalities behind us. So bear with me as I just go into the introduction slides. Let me just see if I can do that. All right, great. So here we go. So welcome everybody, or shall I say Dive Nation of the world. It's great to have you join another Supercharged Dan webinar. Now, my name is Morne Christo, and I'm your host this evening, and I'm also the CEO of Dan Southern Africa. So thank you for making the time to join the webinar. And as always, thank you for supporting Divers Alert Network. Now this evening, the talk topic, which I think is very relevant at this time, given anywhere in the world, is return to diving and COVID. A little bit more about the topic later on in the slides, and as Dr. Cronje takes over from me and presents the talk topic. Now, just a couple of webinar basics and things to know. Your video and mic is turned off, and that's just to ensure that we don't have any unexpected scenes and noises during the presentation. Now, over to you, Dive Nation. Please use the comments box to introduce yourself and tell us where you are in the world, and also let us know what you're expecting from this webinar. Now, if you have any questions during the presentation, please use #ask and then type your question. That helps me and Dr. Cronje just identify the comments from the questions, and then we can address those accordingly. All right, oops, sorry, went back one. So as usual, the replay of the webinar will be available tomorrow via the Dan Southern Africa YouTube channel, and you'll also receive a follow-up email with a replay link if you don't know where to find it. And that email will have a bunch of Dan resources, anything from COVID information to general Dan courses and guides, along with other useful information for divers. So keep a lookout for that email tomorrow. And then once again, I just have to say thank you for supporting Divers Alert Network. Now, if you haven't joined Dan yet, why not join today? And if you are in the Southern Africa region, easy enough, just go to our website. It's dansa.org. If you're in the America or Canada area, go to dan.org. In the European region, daneurope.org. And if you find yourself in the Asia Pacific area, just go to danap.org. Now, to all the active Dan members, thank you for your ongoing support. We really appreciate it. And just a little a plea or request from my end to help us continue offering great content via YouTube channel. Please support the channel by donating via the Super Chat function. And it'll help us just, keep growing and producing great content on a weekly basis. All right, now here's a little free Dan gift just because you've joined the webinar this evening. This really is a must-have Dan guide. It's how to manage diving problems, and it was put together by Dr. Alan Kale. For the folks from South Africa, he is well known amongst us. He has retired at this stage, but he put a great guide together, loads of checklists, tips, tricks, and a whole bunch of useful information for divers when they found themselves in a bit of a problem situation. So I think this is a great guide to have. Now, if you want it, it's really easy. You can just scan that WhatsApp code there. That'll take you to the Dan WhatsApp business account, and you'll find that I've already pre-populated a message. Just it'll say something like, I want the guide, please send me the link. All you need to do is just add your name so that I know who I'm talking to, and I'll send you the link to How to Manage Diving Problems, the Dan Guide by Dr. Alan Cale. So I'll leave that up for a couple of seconds, and what I'll do towards the end of the webinar or presentation, I'll bring the slide up again for those folks that haven't joined yet, and for those folks that were struggling maybe to use the code at this stage. I can see quite a few messages coming through already. All right, so I'll give it another 3, 2, 1, and don't worry, I'll make it available at the end of the presentation again. Now, that's not all. I've really got some great content, and this is really Return to Diving Safely, your guide to getting back into the water, and it really relates to the topic this evening, which is either you've had COVID or you now can get back into diving. And if you scan that code, it'll take you straight to a landing page on the dansa.org website. And from there, you'll find great resources. It gives you a sort of an overview of what the campaign is all about, but it addresses anything from you haven't been in the water or you've been inactive for a while, fitness to dive, checking your gear, and so much more. So this is really a great resource. If you're really dedicated, you can dig and work through it in a couple of days, but I think it'll take you most probably a week or longer to get through all the articles. There are great downloadable guides, tips, tricks, so worthwhile looking at. So again, I'll make this slide available at the end of the presentation. So for those folks that haven't joined, or if you're struggling to make the code work at this stage. Now, lastly, I have to ask you, it'll be great if you can follow us on all our social media channels. Again, if you scan that code, it takes you to a landing page, which will give you direct link to our website, and then to all our social media handles, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, as well as YouTube. Now, it's great because we share content on a daily basis and in different styles. So if you want to stay in touch with what messages we share from an awareness, what's happening in the dive industry, please scan that code and like and share our pages, follow us, that'll be great. Now, while we are on this, we're busy doing a webinar via the Dan Southern Africa YouTube channel. So can I ask you, please, just while you're on listening to me, hit the subscribe button, help us grow our channel so we can extend it beyond just the group of people this evening and start sharing our messages with more and more people. We're about 80 people shy of 4,000 subscribers. I'd like to get it up to 5, 10, and beyond that. So it'll be great if you can help us. And one last thing, don't forget to hit the reminder bell so that you can get reminded whenever we share new content via our YouTube channel. And just by the way, we share content once a week in the form of a diving factoid. And these factoids generally are FAQs we get via the Dan hotline. And Dr. Cronje and myself, we put these together. And it ranges anything from 2 minutes to about 10 minutes, depending on the topic. All right, so over to Dr. Cronje. Let's meet our guest. He is really the one and only Dr. Frans Cronje. And let's find out a little bit who he is for those that don't know. Well, he's the founder of Dan Southern Africa, the former president and CEO, and a medical doctor with a passion for diving. And the list goes on, but I'm not going to add that all in there. For those that have attended any of these presentations, you'll know that he is very knowledgeable and has a passion for dive medicine and diving itself. So for those that don't know, you're in for a treat this evening. Now, before I hand over to Dr. Cronje, a quick topic overview. As I said before, return to diving after COVID. Now, to date, 4 scientific articles have addressed diving and return to diving specifically. Fortunately, there's now sufficient evidence to be more confident in making recommendations regarding return to recreational and commercial diving after recovering from COVID-19. Now, the recommendations contained in one of the articles forms the basis of the talk and offers guidance on return to diving based on the severity of your illness. Now, this is really a quick overview, but last night, myself and Dr. Cronje, we did a test run. He shared his slides with me, and it's really jam-packed, great information. So I think everybody is in for a treat this evening. So sit back, get comfortable, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Cronje. So let's get started. Let me just stop sharing my screen, and hang tight. I'll hand over to you. All right, good evening, Dr. Cronje. Nice to have you on board.
Hi, Mornay. Lovely as always. Welcome, attendees of the webinars. I know you're from all over the world. Mornay's already given me idea of who's listening in, and I consider it a tremendous privilege that you're taking the time to invest in learning a bit more about the topics we're talking about. COVID-19 is not a topic we really want to talk about. I think most of us are a little bit tired of just hearing the word all the time, but the reality is it is shaping our life and our lives, and it is something that we only really will get to grips on if we share information and do it transparently. So part of what I'll be talking about is a little bit of myth busting, maybe in the beginning, just on the COVID story. And then we will focus and zoom in on the return to diving, which is then the thrust of the presentation. And I see people saying hello from wherever they are, from Lithuania, KwaZulu-Natal, Pretoria, PE. It's really great to have you guys listening in. So it's a privilege, and thank you all for that. Okay, so the shape of our webinar tonight is really going to be along the following lines. We're going to look a little bit at the background status quo, some of the take-home messages on testing, because I know there are questions, vaccination and immunotherapy. I'm not going to dwell on that, and as we said in the introduction, we're not talking about vaccination or immunotherapy, but I felt that I needed to put something in. Why it is necessary to have fitness for diving assessments after you've suffered from COVID-19. I'll just explain what we mean when we talk about a MET, or a metabolic equivalent of task, because that has to do with your fitness and your ability to be able to exercise. And then we'll work with a grading system, which really forms the backbone of how we decide how much scrutiny or how much effort we need to put in to determine whether we're fit to dive. And then we summarize at the end and, of course, have opportunity for questions. And I've given Mornay the opportunity to pop in and out and enlarge or reduce my slides if there's something he'd like to draw my attention to, or if there's a question coming in from your side that I need to pay attention to. And I see people from Namibia. It's really from all over the world. And again, a wonderful, wonderful privilege. Okay, so that's really where we're going to start. And my first approach is going to be the background. Now, as most of you know, on December 15, 2019, there was this unusual pneumonia identified in the Chinese city of Wuhan. And by the 8th of January, the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention called it a coronavirus. And by the 11th of 2020, it was declared a pandemic across the world by the World Health Organization. And since then, we've been through 3 waves as we ebb and rise, and it has had tremendous economic impact and influenced businesses, travel, human relationships, and not to mention diving, which is the main focus of our topic tonight. Now, mankind has not been a stranger to coronaviruses. It goes back to the origins of mankind. The common cold is a coronavirus, but we haven't been particularly interested in the common cold because apart from whiskey, milk, nutmeg, warm blankets, and maybe taking a day off work, we haven't had any deaths related to it. So there hasn't been an incentive to invest in a vaccine. But now we're beyond that point. Beyond the original 4, we now have an additional 3 viruses that are causing havoc and are also related to the corona family. And those are the ones we'll be talking about mainly. This, by the way, is what the cold virus, the ordinary homegrown common cold virus, looks like. So again, until 2002, we really weren't interested that much in this virus because it wasn't particularly harmful. And I want to contrast that with what we are also familiar with, which is the influenza virus. Now, influenza viruses are in no way the same as the coronavirus. We get 3 types, A, B, and C, and it's influenza A that causes most of the problems. And it's got these funny appendages, which you can see over here, the blue and the red. And I won't give you the full Latin name, but basically the abbreviation is H and N for these different prongs. And they're different configurations. They're about 9 of each. And that's why you can get H1, N3, H4, N9, H7, N3, and so on, because they influence the way the virus interacts with our bodies. And based on that, the vaccines are produced every year as we go into flu season. It's pointless making a vaccine in advance because as these things change, the vaccine that is intended to protect you somewhat against the virus is produced accordingly. So that's just a little bit of a background on the influenza virus. One very big difference between influenza and the common cold is that the common cold, as we grow older, we become more and more exposed to the 4 main variants, and we find that less and less people get a common cold as they grow older. The opposite is true for the influenza virus, and that's why vaccination is recommended for people who are vulnerable, who are exposed to a lot of people who may be sick, who are in the healthcare industry, and of course, as we age. Okay, so from there, we're now going to be talking mainly about the so-called beta coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2. Viruses essentially resemble animals in as far as they have a genus and a species. So you have different variants, and you have the CoV-1 and CoV-2 virus, which is essentially like a different animal within a cluster of viruses which have been called the beta viruses. I'll explain more about that in a moment. The dilemma is that some of these viruses are animal specific, usually because they have particular appendages that are designed to attach to some unique feature to what is on the cell lining of a particular animal. When there is a common receptor between animals, then of course we have, or we can have, what we call a zoonosis. And what that means is we now have the ability of a virus, or the virus has the ability to jump from the original animal where it starts to another animal in many cases, and from there often to humans. And most of the deadliest plagues we've had have been zoonoses. They're the ones that essentially have jumped from mostly bats and then to other animals over to humans. And in the case of influenza, just briefly, it's usually been pigs and ducks. And that's why we refer to swine flu or avian flu depending on whether the mixing bowl or the amplifying animal is either a pig or a bird. So that is essentially where that's come from. Now, if we just look now at the coronaviruses primarily, you will see that there are two branches over here, the Coronaviridae, and within the subgroup, we have an alpha, beta, delta, and gamma coronavirus. But the ones that give us hassles are these. What makes it confusing, though, is all of these are beta coronaviruses, but the strains we get when we refer to these different viruses, particularly SARS-CoV-2, is also called alpha, beta, delta, gamma, and now lambda. So don't get confused between the beta coronavirus, which, if you like, is the family name, and then the strain, which is also alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and as I say, now even lambda. And here's what you can see. And the practical reason of why we refer to the strains as alpha, beta, gamma, delta, because, for instance, the delta virus, the official name is B16172. Now, that's not exactly memorable. That's the delta variant, by the way, which is the most transmissible of the SARS-CoV-2 viruses. The beta virus, B1351, is the one that originated from South Africa. So that's just to give you a little bit of an explanation as to why we have these weird names and what we mean when we refer to them. This is, if you like, sort of a history line of the coronaviruses. Back in the 1960s, we had 4 viruses. We pretty much knew them by their first names, if you like, and we weren't particularly worried because they didn't kill anybody. And then suddenly, out of the blue, in 2002, there was suddenly a beta coronavirus that spread, fortunately not too wide, about 29 countries, infected 8,000 people and killed 800 of them. So the case mortality rate was 10%, and that got people's attention. Now suddenly it wasn't just a common cold anymore. And it started a real, let's call it quantum leap in research that we are benefiting from today, because much of what we know about SARS-CoV-2 we learned from SARS-CoV-1. 12 years later, in the Middle East, we developed the MERS or MERS-CoV, which stands for Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, just like SARS stands for Sudden Acute Respiratory Syndrome, and that spread to 27 countries. To date, there have been 24 or let's say 25,000 cases, and literally to today, we've had 800 deaths. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it means in practice that 35% of people who suffered from the virus died. And that, again, is not something to be ignored. Ironically, since last month, there have been no new cases of MERS. It may be that it's been overshadowed by COVID-19, but it has not spread. And one of the reasons for that is because it basically, and that's true for both SARS-CoV-1 and MERS, is because you get sick quickly and you either live or you die. And some would argue you shouldn't call it a benefit, but in a way it is in terms of eradicating it, because what it meant was you could very quickly identify who had it, you could isolate them, you could treat them as best you could, and that's the end of it. Not so in the case of SARS-CoV-2, which unfortunately, as you'll see, has a very large number of people who are, I'm just trying to see, I heard a ping here, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Doesn't look like it. Is that you have a lot of people, up to 25%, some say even as high as 38% of people who don't show any signs. So you don't know whether they're sick or not, and they may pass on the disease. In addition, to date, and I literally looked at the statistics just before this presentation, we have 172 countries that are affected. We have 186 million people who have died. We have 15 million people who are ill, visibly ill, due to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. We have 2.8 million people who have been tested, but most importantly and encouragingly, we have 160 million people who have recovered fully. So that's really, really good news. This, again, as I mentioned earlier, is to show you where the viruses have come from. And you can see in the case of MERS, it was the Egyptian tomb bat. In the case of the first SARS virus, it was the horseshoe bat. And the latest SARS virus has come from fruit bats. It, by the way, is also responsible for Ebola. What has been unknown until very recently is which animals are essentially the amplifiers. We've known in the case of SARS-CoV-1, it's the palm civet because it had the same receptors. But in the case of SARS-2, what made it so difficult was because it uses the so-called angiotensin receptor. Now, angiotensin is a receptor which controls blood pressure, and it does so in a number of animals. It does so in orangutans, most monkeys, cats, dogs, obviously a number of rodents, and a whole host of animals, which means that there are a whole lot of animals that are causing variants and leading to slight variations in the virus, which has led to its spread throughout the world. Okay, and here's another very important difference which I've alluded to earlier, and that is the key difference between SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. It's this: the number of patients with mild disease. In SARS-CoV-1, it was low. In other words, there were very few people that did not show symptoms. In SARS-CoV-2, it's high, up to 20, and some say up to 38%. And of those, about a fifth may ultimately need some form of medical care. So can you just imagine 6 billion people, of which 20% may need hospital care? You can just imagine the enormous burden it's put on medical supplies and medical staff. And sometimes, fortunately, the amount of care has been trivial. In other words, a little bit of oxygen and the person's been fine to be sent home. But in some cases, it has led to severe illness, and the older individuals have been, the more likely they've had additional illnesses, and therefore the more vulnerable they've been. So the greatest casualties have been amongst the so-called elderly, which seeing I'm now 55, it's always 10 years further than where you are. Well, basically, it's above 60. So it's quite a shock when you read articles talking about the elderly and you suddenly realize, well, they're talking about you. And so the emphasis on immunotherapy has been to try and protect the vulnerable, which is the elderly. It's been those who have been most exposed to individuals with the disease, and of course, people who would be most likely to pass on the disease. So that's where the emphasis has really been until now. A couple of words on testing. Testing, we're all familiar with testing, and there are two main types of tests that we do when it comes to pretty much anything from pregnancy to AIDS. We have a screening test, which is designed to catch pretty much everyone. In other words, it's very unlikely that you will miss an individual. However, there is a good chance that you will pick up individuals that will show positive on the test, but when you then do a subsequent diagnostic test, are negative. Let me use AIDS, for instance, which we're familiar with. If you have a negative initial HIV test, then the chances that it's negative is very good unless you're in the window period. If you have a positive HIV test, the chance that it actually is truly positive is only about 60%, which means there needs to be a subsequent diagnostic test to actually pick up whether it truly is HIV or not. And the same is now true for the COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. So we have positive and negative tests, but we need to realize that when it comes to the NTS, which I like, which is my acronym, which is nose, throat, or saliva tests, if you have a negative test, it is most reliable. So a negative test is very reliable, whereas a positive test can be anything between 70 to 90% accurate. So it's not to say if you have a positive nasal test that you actually do have COVID-19. In a similar way, the blood tests, which are the diagnostic tests that rely on either the virus or the body's immune system and its response to the virus, depend on whether or not you have really had a significant viral load, if you're testing for the virus, or you've had a very strong immune response, which means that there are a lot of immunoglobulins which you can pick up with a test. And once again, as you can imagine, it may be possible to miss. And we must realize that there is no such thing as a perfect test. And we need to bear that in mind, and perhaps also have more patience with governments and scientists that sometimes seem to be giving contradictory advice, because you can just imagine between tests that aren't 100% reliable, because no test is, and the large population of individuals that are asymptomatic and yet are ill, it's very difficult to form hard and fast policies. And that brings us to what is this whole business about these 2-week lockdowns? Morne, was there something you'd like to say there?
No, I've just taken the full screen down so that they can view you now, Frans.
Okay, all right. So I'll wave just so that at least you can see I'm actually here and speaking to you. All right. So what is it about the lockdowns? Well, It's basically this. Within 2 weeks, you're either sick enough that people know you're sick, or if you were sick, asymptomatic or not, you are no longer infective, or you weren't sick at all. So by 14 days, there's a certain amount of confidence, irrespective of all these fancy tests that we do, that people would either definitely be sick, have recovered, or were never sick at all. But that is not a practical proposal long term, because we can't close businesses for 2 weeks on a continual basis. I mean, it's crippling the economy of many countries. The other thing that is often mooted is the so-called test 72 hours prior to flights. Why? Well, the reason for that is 72 hours prior to flying, if you then have a negative test, then there is reason to believe that you're not going to become infective within the period prior to flying, and therefore unlikely to infect other passengers. So that's really where that 72-hour period has come from. It's not perfect, but at least it has given some confidence, and it has abbreviated the 14-day wait, and many companies now use the 72-hour approach in combination with tests. Okay, so I hope that's made sense. If anybody has a question, I can maybe just allow a minute or two if there's a burning question about that. I'm not a virologist, so the chances are I may need to pass it on.
So for the moment, let's just give, there's usually like a 20-second lag, from the streaming platform to YouTube and other places. So let's just see, we'll give it a half a minute or so. If not, then we can continue, Dr. Cronje.
Okay. Well, Morne, can I ask you at least, is it intelligible enough up to now?
Yes, for now it's been great. Set the tone for what's to come. So I believe that everybody is having a great time and learning a lot, loads of information, and yeah, please keep going.
And it may be necessary to watch this again to get the gist of it. But I hope it clarifies some of the misnomers and some of the myths and some of the advice that's been given that hasn't been based on scientific evidence. Okay, so here's the take-home message, which may answer the question that could have popped up there, and that is this. In an effort to reduce this into a nutshell, the wrinkle is that we need to tease out people who are infected, busy incubating the virus, eventually becoming sick, and of course those that would really become seriously sick. Of these, 25% are sick but don't show it, and we therefore need to allow these 3 to 5 days to sort out those who will or those who won't get sick. If you aren't sick by 72 hours, the chances are that you won't get sick. But if you're exposed to someone who has COVID, then of course the 72-hour clock starts all over again. Secondly, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, a negative nasal swab is the most reliable test in terms of showing that you truly are negative. And lastly, asymptomatic individuals are very difficult to conclusively prove as having COVID because of the nature of the diagnostic test. And one of the practical things that some airlines and companies have used is the sort of household test, which means if you shack up a family together for 72 hours and nobody's sick, well, then it's not COVID-19. So that has been one of the pragmatic approaches to this. Okay, so with that, let's move on to one more, perhaps slightly controversial aspect, which is the whole vaccination versus immunotherapy. Why do I call it immunotherapy? Well, the reason for it is that if you look at the original definition of a vaccine is a suspension of either a kill or a lame virus that is administered to cause a partial disease or at least an immune reaction, so that if you get exposed to the actual disease, you'll be ready to fight it. Now you can imagine there is no such thing as a safe vaccine, because a vaccine in that sense is designed to make you sick, but not as sick as the ultimate sickness it's trying to protect you from. And that's why the companies in America about 16 years ago went to the US Congress and said, you need to give us a blank check to be able to produce vaccines and not be sued if people get sick, because there is no such thing as a safe vaccine. So it's a calculated risk, and the calculated risk means, is the vaccine or the risk of the vaccine greater than the risk of the disease? And those questions are being asked of diseases such as measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough, and a number of other diseases for a variety of reasons. One of them being that the diseases are less prevalent or that the treatments are better. So many things influence those choices. Notice, however, the second part of the slide, and this is the expanded definition. Any substance used to stimulate the production of antibodies, provide immunity against one or several diseases, prepared from the causative agent of the disease, its product, or synthetic substitute, treated to act as an antigen, in other words, something the immune system will respond to without inducing the disease. Well, even with this expanded definition, not all the immune therapies comply with that definition. So, strictly speaking, there isn't actually a vaccine in the rigid sense of the word. But because people are so used to the word vaccine being used, it's much easier to say and call it a vaccine than to say, well, it's immunotherapy. I'm just using the distinction tonight so that you notice the difference between the two. Okay? Okay, now here's a biggie. Does immunotherapy or a series of vaccines, does it guarantee immunity? Well, the bottom line is we don't have enough evidence. Why? Well, for one, we simply don't know. And secondly, some people don't seem sick. So you don't know whether they would or did or would or have or haven't had the disease or not. So you cannot guarantee immunity. There is, however, some evidence that the immunotherapy lessens the severity of the disease. And that is why it has become justified that vulnerable populations or highly exposed individuals such as healthcare workers, particularly people working in ICU or in theater or where there are a lot of droplets hanging around, for them to have some form of immunotherapy. But at this stage, there is insufficient evidence on COVID-19 or immunotherapy to completely know whether it works and what the long-term effects will be. Now, I'm not trying to be a naysayer, and I'm not saying that I'm anti-vaccine. What I'm saying is we need to expect the reality of what it does. It may minimize the severity of the disease, but it's not to say if you've had an immune therapy that you won't get COVID-19. And that's why there is perhaps the sort of crazy making situation where you get the immunotherapy and you still wear the mask and you still have social distancing, etc., etc. It's because we don't know what we don't know. Now, as far as the vaccines or immunotherapy itself goes, the ones in red are the ones that are available in South Africa. This is a busy slide, and I'm not trying to teach you on the different immunotherapies, other than to say that the J&J vaccine, which probably is the closest, together with the AstraZeneca, which is the closest to the concept of the original vaccine, the J&J one offers some protection against the Delta strain and is also the one that's been used most commonly in the US. The Moderna and the Pfizer or biotech immunotherapy is mRNA based. In other words, it's actually genetic material that is injected that is designed to stimulate your immune system to recognize and attach to the spike, which is one of the common elements of the COVID-19 virus, or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But again, they're not identical, and it seems that the Pfizer one might be slightly more effective against the Delta, which is the most transmissible version of the virus at the moment, the Delta variant. In other words, the chance of it being spread from one person to another is the greatest with Delta, but that is not to say that it is most likely to produce the most deadly form of COVID-19. That's not the case. So again, just see how difficult these decisions can be. In the case of injecting the mRNA material, there is a risk of anaphylaxis. In other words, you can have an allergic reaction, which means when these become available, or if they are provided where they are available, you are monitored for at least half an hour to see that you don't collapse due to an allergy. Also, in the case of the J&J immunotherapy or vaccine, there have been coagulation disorders, in other words, people having clotting disorders, which have subsequently also been discovered in some of the other forms of immunotherapy. And so you'll read every day, if you have the app, if you have access to news on this, you will get this sort of information every day. And sadly, it's adding to some of the angst or the concern about it, but it is the reality of why this particular strain of virus is giving us such uphill. One last thing that I need to point out, and this is true in South Africa, and this appeared today, is the concern that employers now face in making the workplace safe. Are they legally required to insist that getting immunotherapy is a requirement of the job? Well, this has not been tested in court yet. In the United States and in New Zealand, it is in court at the moment. I can tell you that the labor factions are not really going to go for this, and as I say, because the immunotherapy does not provide a guarantee there are many arguments, scientific and other, that would really make it very hard to make it an absolute requirement. But some companies do, and some companies follow this principle. But it is something that's out there, and I think in the days to come, we are going to see more and more of this as the infection becomes a protracted pandemic. Okay, right. Now, why am I involved? Well, this is a picture of me and my wife Lucy actually applying a hood or head tent, which is usually used in hyperbaric medicine, that was produced by a company called Unique. And we had the privilege of being involved in the development and training of a very inexpensive way of providing high flow oxygen within a head tent, which meant that the patient got oxygen even under slight pressure, and the spread of the virus to the surrounding staff was minimal. So that's really how I got involved, and why I was asked to prepare this presentation and the article that went with it. Okay, so, all right, after all of this, let's now get to the whole business of why the fuss about COVID-19 fitness for dive assessment after you've recovered. Well, the reason for that was largely in response to an article that a doctor by the name of Frans Cronje published from Innsbruck on the 15th of April 2020, when he described the extensive lung damage that he encountered in some of his patients, and particularly in a 40-year-old male that still had significant scarring of the lungs up to 3 months afterwards. Not long afterwards, all or most of the undersea and hyperbaric associations in our country, the Southern African Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Association, SPUMS, etc., and of course DAN, started producing guidelines to try and assist people in forging their way or finding their way back to whether or not it is safe for them to dive, and what they should do in order to be cleared for diving. Which brings me to one extra and last element of the virus that I want to mention. One of the things we didn't know in the beginning was that a part of the virus's action within the body was not just clamping down on the angiotensin receptor, but actually causing a so-called cytokine storm. Now, simply said, cytokines are basically a whole host of proteins that are released when the body is threatened. And the cytokines then have different ways of activating parts of the immune system, and in the process may actually cause disease or may cause additional symptoms. They also led to some of the clotting phenomena, and the clotting phenomena then led to other organs, not just the lungs, becoming infected. And so now suddenly people had brain, liver, intestinal, kidney, and even heart problems that were also part of the COVID-19 problem. And in fact, we now know that between 5 and 20% of individuals who have had COVID-19 still have some of these symptoms over here, like fatigue, headache, the loss of smell and taste, which has been one of the classic signs, shortness of breath, palpitations or irregular heartbeat, heart inflammation, pain in the muscles, even forgetfulness and depression. And all of these may be longer term consequences of COVID-19. And the question is, Clearly, it's not a good idea to go diving if you still have some of those long-term side effects. So that's one of the reasons why there has been an additional concern. So we don't know what we don't know. And that is something that we have to come to terms with, although I can tell you that there are scientists and labs around the clock working at finding solutions. And it is not just financially driven, it's not just politically driven. There are bona fide, hardworking, ethical, and honest scientists that are really wanting to help find people solutions that we can get back to, let's call it, closer to the old normal rather than the new normal that we have mentioned so commonly in the last 2 years. Okay, a definition I just briefly want to give you, because we'll mention this when we talk about fitness, is the so-called MET, or metabolic equivalent of task. What that really means is how much energy you spend. Now, to make this a bit more real, or a bit more easy to get your arms around, if you play a hard game of soccer, then it means that you're expending 10 METs. And that is pretty much what is expected of a commercial diver returning to diving. They need to be able to expend 10 METs, whereas backpacking, and that is fairly strenuous backpacking, is 7 METs. And that is what is expected of recreational divers, 6 to 7 METs. And 1 MET, just if you want the definition, is spending 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. Okay, now that's very abstract, and that's why I showed you these particular sports. So with that, let's have a look at the grading system, because the grading system is the framework or the backbone which has been used to really indicate when a person is able, or what sort of tests might need to be done in order for them to know whether it's safe to return to diving. So here's the grading system, and you're going to see it a number of times. So don't worry if you don't catch it the first time. It's based on this article by Sadler that really published it for the first time together with his co-workers, and came up with the idea of grade 0 individuals, who are either the individuals who aren't sick or don't appear sick or aren't sick at all. Grade 1, who are the people who are sick but were able or are able to go through the period of self-isolation of 14 days without needing any medical care. Grade 2, who are the individuals who go to a hospital or get medical care, which may range from just supplemental oxygen to maybe additional fluids, but they don't spend a long time in hospital, and they do not have to go onto a ventilator, and they do not have cardiac or clotting disorders. That's very important. So grade 2 are the ones that did go to hospital, but they still didn't have heart or clotting disorders, which inevitably brings me to the grade 3, which, as you imagine, are the people that had a longer admission, were in high care or ICU, were on a ventilator perhaps, and had either cardiac, neurological, or clotting problems. Okay? So that's the grading system, and you'll see it again. Before I take it further, again, a reminder, when we look at return to work, let alone return to diving, we look at 3 principles. ability, resilience, and risk. And the first one is ability, which brings me to the 10 and the 6 METs. So you should be able to exercise as a commercial diver at least at the level of exertion of 10 METs, and as a recreational diver, 6 METs. The next is resilience. It's pointless for you to be able to do it for one day and then you're out for the count for the next 4 or 5 days. That's not resilience. So you haven't fully recovered. There needs to be consistent performance and you must be able to keep it up. So that is an important second principle in terms of returning to diving. And the third is risk. And the risk is, firstly, the risk to others. So that's that 14-day period, and the fact that you are no longer infective. The second is that your lungs weren't damaged through ventilation or the illness itself, that they may be subject to barotrauma. The fact that you are unlikely to develop decompression illness, because as you'll see when I show you some of the scans of the lungs can get significant damage that could cause gas embolism without necessarily getting a pneumothorax. No cognitive dysfunction, meaning you can't remember to look at your gauge, or you have significant problems remembering even simple things, and fatigue, which gets back to the fitness component. Okay, so we have ability, resilience, and risk. Okay, so now with that, we're going to look at the different grades. Grade 0. Now, grade 0, you'll remember, are the people that either don't seem sick or aren't sick. And these individuals, you pretty much won't know who they are because the articles read between 16 and 38% of individuals with an average of 25% are asymptomatic. So you won't even know. And if you then need to decide whether to return to diving after COVID-19, well, you don't know you've had COVID-19. It happened in the background, or it may have been diagnosed coincidentally, but you had no symptoms. Okay, so that's grade 0. Then we've got grade 1. These are the individuals that could manage at home. Quarantine means you don't know whether you're going to get sick. Self-isolation means that you are sick, but it's not so bad that you need to go to the hospital. So it's fairly minor symptoms and you don't need medical care. So that's grade 1 or mild COVID-19. Grade 2 or moderate means you did need to go to the hospital, even if it was for a short period, maybe for testing, oxygen supplementation, but not ventilation. If x-rays were taken, the x-rays looked normal and there was no evidence that you had a clotting disorder. So up to that point, it's a very, very mild disease. Grade 3, however, are the individuals who went to high care or ICU, who needed to go onto a ventilator. They had inflammation around the heart, abnormalities of heart function, neurological abnormalities, clotting abnormalities, and those were discovered either through x-rays or an ECG or what we call an echocardiogram. In other words, they did a sonar of the heart and they could see that it was taking a strain. So those obviously were the most severe cases. Okay, so I think by now we've got the grade system down pat. Now let me throw in another wrinkle. Another wrinkle that happened was that in the studies that were done in trying to find out who did or didn't have the disease, lo and behold, a number of people who did not have COVID-19, or certainly didn't display symptoms of it, were discovered to have these things marked by the red arrows, which are called blebs. And blebs are where the alveoli essentially break down, or their walls break down, and they become clumps. So instead of individual little grapes, you now have a sack. And in the past, we used to say, if you have a bleb, you can't dive. Now we've had to soften our position there because we've realized that it is so common that the radiologists who were reporting on people getting lung CTs for COVID, they stopped reporting on blebs. They were that common. And so now the situation is as follows. If you have a normal chest X-ray that doesn't show anything suggestive of a bleb, or if you had a lung CT that showed the upper parts of the lungs, this part of the lung, having a bleb, that is no longer considered to be a contraindication to diving unless it's very large, for two reasons. One is this part of the lung usually gets a lot of ventilation but very little circulation. It's just the nature of how our lungs are designed. They are also the least likely to cause a pneumothorax. So apical blebs are no longer an absolute contraindication to diving, but if the blebs are lower down in the lung, then they get a lot of circulation and bubbles may be injected into the circulation. So that is something to be aware of, but we hold to the standard that if the X-ray looks normal, we don't insist on you necessarily having to go through to a lung CT if the X-ray looks normal. Now, on the other hand, I think you can guess that this is a chest X-ray of a person who has COVID-19, and in fact, they've developed a pneumothorax. That's the edge of the lung there. So they've actually had a pneumothorax. And those individuals are by no means able to return to diving at that stage. These individuals, if they go to a CT, have lungs that look like these. And this, you may have read, is what we call the ground glass appearance of the lungs. It looks like glass that has been ground up. And you also get scarring of the lung, which may be in crazy patterns, crazy scarring of the lungs, and then pockets of blebs in between these areas of scarring. Now, if that's the case, we have concerns, because these individuals are at risk of developing either lung barrow trauma or gas embolism or a pneumothorax. So we are concerned about those. But here's the good news. The fact that your lungs looked like this at the beginning doesn't mean that they will always look that way, which means that sometimes after a year, if people are subjected to a subsequent CT, these markers of damage have actually cleared. So it's not to say that you will never be able to return to diving, but it's certainly not at this particular stage. Okay. Any questions so far, Mornay? Nobody hassling you?
So, Dr. Cronje, there are some questions, but I think we might as well get on with it, unless There's one or two about the vaccines, and Dr. Everett Bauer also just made a comment regarding vaccines. So if you'd like to answer those, that's fine. Otherwise, we can push on until the end and then address all the questions.
Okay, well, if the audience would indulge me maybe just to bulldoze through the slides, and then after that, I'll go back to some of the earlier slides if necessary. Bearing in mind, please, I'm not a virologist, I'm not an expert on Ebola, and there are some questions that I may very well ask you to render to an email, and if I can't answer it, then I may ask one of our virologists or the other pulmonologists, experts, to give an opinion on that. Okay, so what do we do in a nutshell about this whole business of COVID and diving? Well, let's return to it in a nutshell. People who return to diving or undertake diving are generally required to complete one or other version of this recreational scuba training council or the more modern questionnaires. By the way, if you complete these questionnaires, please don't make check boxes or X's or Y's and N's, because if you write and clearly they may be misconstrued, write clearly yes or no. That's just a very important tip. The principle being that if there's a yes, then the person needs to be cleared by a diving doctor. And be responsible about that, because after all, it's not only about your life, it's also about those you dive with. So the RSTC form will be a common component to pretty much anybody returning to diving, because you will indicate that you had COVID-19, with the exception of those that didn't know they had it. They'll probably then just mark no if there is something related to a cough. Okay, and here a quick revision of the grades. Grade 0 are the asymptomatic. The grade 1s are the self-care folks. Grade 2 are the quick hospital admissions, but no secondary damage and no ventilation. And the grade 3s are the people who needed significant medical care and may have had additional organ involvement. So the grade 0s, you'll fill in the RSTC form. Unless you've got another disease, it's likely to be no on all counts, and there's no reason to prevent these individuals from returning to diving. Grade 1 means you know you've had COVID and you took care of yourself, but you don't necessarily know whether your fitness has returned to normal, whether your heart function has returned to normal, whether your lung functions have returned to normal, and whether your chest X-ray is normal. Therefore, these individuals should undergo those tests as part of their preparation to return to diving. And if all the above essentially come out normal, then they can return to diving within 2 weeks, although most people, and us as doctors tend to be rather conservative, would even suggest that they might want to wait 3 months. If it comes to grade 2, however, and these are the individuals that did go to hospital, they should not only get those tests, but they should definitely wait 3 months. Okay? So it's the same form, the same exams. If the chest X-ray is abnormal, they'll probably undergo a chest CT, and they should wait at least 3 months. And then lastly, The ones who were really, really very ill, spent a long time in hospital, maybe got ventilation, maybe not, they also will indicate COVID on their form, but they now need to prove that their exercise abilities return to normal, their lung functions have returned to normal, their chest x-rays are normal, and they need some additional heart scans, and many physicians will insist on a lung CT for those individuals. Either way, one should not dive within 6 months, and if the lung CT was abnormal, you could consider reevaluation after 12 months, because some of the abnormalities in the lungs do seem to go back to normal. Okay, so that's the ones that are grade 3. All the tests and probably lung CT, and at least 6 to 12 months before going back. So let's put it in a nutshell. Grade 0, no restrictions. Grade 1, well, if you want to push it, then you could do it within 2 weeks or so, but we really like 3 months. Grade 2, 6 months if it's normal, and grade 3, 12 months, and if there were complications, they should be reassessed at that stage to see whether things have returned to normal. And all of these are summarized in the article that you'll get the reference to after the webinar, and you can go back to and go and study it for yourselves and see how you will apply it in your respective diving businesses, or in the case that you had COVID-19. Please remember that Dan is there for you, and if you can't remember or you're not sure, please call us and please make use of the resources that we make available to you. And in addition to that, you will find all the statements by the various dive medical groups that essentially just reinforce what we have just gone through. And with that, that's really the bottom line on returning to diving after COVID-19. So after that, let's take some questions, if there are any, and I'll do my very best to answer them.
Well, first of all, Dr. Cronje, thank you for a fantastic presentation. It was great taking it right from the start to actually give us perspective on how diving doctors evaluate people that have suffered with or from COVID, depending on the different levels, as you've mentioned. And I think that puts it into perspective, you know. But I have seen there are some questions, some you have addressed, but I think it's worthwhile going back, because quite often I find we ask questions, but there's more to it, you know, and as we discuss them, I'm sure, you know, more will come from it. So this was quite early on. It was from Honey, wanting to know when can we dive after COVID, and I think you've addressed it right towards the end. Now, Honey, if you're still on online, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit on that, please just add that in the comment box. But Dr. Cronje, anything just as a wrap-up that you'd like to add there?
Well, the answer was this one, the nutshell: grade 0, you didn't know you're sick or you weren't sick, no restrictions. Grade 1, you cared for yourself at home, you never needed to see someone for oxygen, wait 3 months. Grade 2, wait 6 months. Grade 3, wait at least 12 months. And in all the last 3 cases, 1, 2, and 3, you will have marked yes on the RSTC form, which by definition means that you need to go to a doctor, preferably a diving doctor. And many of them will typically phone Dan or refer to the same article that I presented this on, so the advice should be consistent. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Cronje. I'll scroll down and see if there are more. This is just a revisit of Tracy Lee's question, which she did answer in a lot of detail. She did go on and she said, well, you know, they share everything. And she also then mentions that we both had the nasal swab, you know. So I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, or do you feel that you've answered that previously?
Well, I suppose all I can say about the nasal swab, and let me just get that slide,
Okay.
is that a negative nasal swab is meaningful because it's just the nature of how statistics work and what we call sensitivity and specificity, which means how likely is it to pick it up and how likely, if it does pick it up, is it actually the disease? That's called sensitivity and specificity. From those two parameters, we get what we call positive predictive value and negative predictive value. And the negative predictive value of a negative NTS, that's nose, throat, and spit test, is the highest. It's in some cases even 100%. So a negative nasal swab test, if it's done properly, is very reassuring. But a positive nasal swab test does not necessarily mean that you have COVID-19, although at this stage, in the state of, I would say, angst that exists in the world, people may tend to treat it as a diagnostic test, which it is not. It's a screening test. And the right thing to do would be to do a subsequent follow-up test to actually verify using blood whether or not there are viral particles or evidence of reaction to the virus. Having said that, of course, some people have immunoglobulins circling in their blood for weeks after they have already healed of the infection. So it really isn't straightforward and sometimes requires discretion on the side of the doctor. And again, those periods of 14 days and so on that are used in conjunction with, for instance, other people in the household, the symptoms that were had, the recovery, and so on, to come up with some sensible conclusion. But it is not, it's not ironclad, and no one should pretend that it is.
Fantastic. Well, Tracy Lee, I hope that answers your question. Here's another one from Anna Catherine. Can you see it on your screen, Dr. Cronje?
I can. Yes. Question was, I got my second vaccine shot. I don't know which one that is, so that makes it a little bit difficult to answer more specifically. Do we need a refreshment soon? I'm working as a nurse in healthcare. So let me get to that slide. Here's the slide that shows the ones in South Africa, and here are the intervals. So the J&J one is a single dose. The others vary, and they are still at this stage arguing whether it's better to give them further apart or closer. It's not certain, but what is known is that there is significant, for instance, in the Pfizer immunotherapy, even after the first dose, it claims 94 effectiveness. So that's possibly the one that you had. And if that's the case, well, it'll be 3 weeks before you get your second one, but there's already 94% effectiveness against severe disease with that particular immunotherapy. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, great stuff. Thank you for that. I'm sure it is. I think it's a bit difficult not knowing which vaccine was used. So if you're still on the call, Catherine, you're welcome to just let us know. Then it's just a comment by Dr. Evert Bauer. I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, Dr. Cronje.
I see a comment here. Remember that the outcome of the COVID vaccines or immunotherapy is not for COVID prevention, but for complicated COVID and death. And I agree with that. In other words, it's not a guarantee against the disease. It is, and I did say it maybe not clearly enough, it is essentially to lessen the severity of the infection. That is the point. And well made, and I echo that in whoever made that comment.
All right, well, great. That was from Dr. Evert Bauer. Anyway, so we've got another question, I think, yeah, from Gerry Potgieter.
Okay, the question is, what may be the top 5 to 10 preconditions which would be likely to adversely affect any vaccine? That's a difficult one to answer simply. If you've had previous reactions to vaccines, some of the vaccines are more likely to give you adverse reactions. If you are an individual who have allergic tendencies or very strong immune tendencies, for instance, if you get flu, the chances are that you will get a stronger reaction because your immune system is somewhat primed. So those would be some of the preconditions that could predispose, but it would be best to get that information directly from the horse's mouth and to read and to get information based on the actual vaccine or immunotherapy that is offered.
All right. Okay, well, Gerry, I hope that answers your question. I see he's answered another or asked another question later on, but let's just run down the side here. This is a question. Hi, Dr. Mornay. Will chest x-rays during an ENG1 medical highlight any of the scarring mentioned in the presentation? And then would you suggest highlighting to the doctor that you have had COVID-19?
Okay. Again, this is an uncertain time. But what I will tell you on the basis of the article and the evidence that we have, if you have had COVID-19 and you get a chest x-ray done and the chest x-ray does not indicate anything suspicious, and it would be important for the sake of the radiologists that just like, anybody get tired looking at x-ray after x-ray after x-ray, mention that you have had COVID-19, that they look at it through a fine-tooth comb. But if you come through that examination and that is clear, there's no reason to believe that you are at any greater risk than someone that doesn't even know that they had COVID-19. So that's all I would say at this stage, based on the best knowledge we think we have. Please remember, as doctors, we give the best advice we can from the information that we have, but we are far from perfect, and our advice is often changing. Just to make that point very vividly, when poor Dr. Lister 300 years ago said that bacteria or people needed to practice cleanliness when doing operations, some of the surgeons, in defiance, actually would take the scalpel that they were using to operate on the person, and they would scrape it at the bottom of the sole of their shoe to show how little they believed in what Dr. Lister was saying.
Sure.
And science eventually showed that he was right. So in all humility, I need to say that we don't know what we don't know, but we have at least got some guidelines that can give reassurance. But watch the space, because tomorrow there may be an article coming out that may even refute some of the things that I've said today. So be aware of that.
Yeah. Ever changing. Yeah. Sort of the goalposts
Ever
and
changing.
the markers are keep changing the whole time. So I'm going to refer to Mr. L or Lucas. I hope that answers your question. If you're still online, just give us a thumbs up or let us know. We've got Dirk Buerter here. He wants to know everything you said. Does this also apply to free divers? Now, my gut says yes, but you're the expert, and I'll hand it over to you.
Well, the answer is perhaps a bit more pragmatic. The chances of developing barotrauma with pre-diving is typically less, although theoretically, if there's significant scarring, you can get gas trapping, and there may be an indication to undergo more extensive pulmonary investigations to make sure that there isn't air trapping. But by and large, free divers, if they feel fit enough to do free diving, can't have lungs that have been significantly affected. Because, if your lungs look like the lungs that you see on the slide here on the right-hand side, there's no way you are going to go free diving.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dirk, I hope that answers your question. If not, and you're still online, pop something in the comments box for us. I'll just fly through these. Tracy just says, excellent. Thank you, I guess, for the presentation answer. Quentin says, thanks. Learned a lot. That's good to know. Kenny says, very informative. Thank you. Scuba News. That's Conrad from Vereniging side. It gives us hope to get back into the water, so that's great. Glad that we can shed some light on that. Who've got you, Andrea? Really clear presentation. Thank you very much. Well, only a pleasure. And I assume this is Dr. Gary Morris. Great to have you on board. If it is you, thank you. I hope this was good to you. So, we've got a regular person that attends our webinars and engages with our content at Sumari. She's got a question here. She says, should I go for a full dive medical after a second shot of Pfizer? And how long after should I have those tests done?
Okay, this question is actually mixing two things. The one is getting the immunotherapy, and the other thing is the question of having the tests done. Now, it has been the practice in several countries of giving immunotherapy to people who have had COVID-19. And it seems a bit counterintuitive because one would think that if you've had the disease, then you shouldn't get it again. Why do you need immunotherapy? Well, one of the reasons is because they're different strains, and because you want to have protection against that. If you have just had the immunotherapy to protect you against the illness, then you would be grade 0, which means diving isn't an issue. How long before you should have the tests done? Well, the tests would be irrelevant because on your RSDC form, you might mark that you had immune therapy, but not that you were sick. So I think we must just tease those two things apart. And if you have time and you'd like to, you can post it in an email, or you can even ask the question now. But the question is, are you sick, or have you had immune therapy, or have you had both? And based on that, one can then ultimately do the grading.
All right. Well, Sumari, if you're still online, you can pop another comment or question in the comments box, Dr. Cronje said, or the follow-up email will allow you to engage with me, and I will then pass it on to Dr. Cronje. So either way, you can connect with us. All right, so we've got Rian here. He says, evening, doctor. What about diving with trimix and also deep diving? Is there any different approach, or is it similar?
That's a very good question for a number of reasons. the one good thing about deeper diving is that the pressure volume changes are small, which means that firstly, you're not going to have big expansion of bullae or blebs within the lung, which is one of the risk factors. The second thing is that you are more likely to be able to absorb amounts of oxygen. The helium will also be able to flow in and out with very little additional resistance. Um, to what extent it may be wise to adjust your decompression profile, that's another question. I would probably, and again, this isn't something I can give you a hard number on, you would probably want to have a more conservative decompression profile, especially in terms of significant jumps, significant steps in the shallow dive range. In the deeper range, where the pressure volume change is not that big, it's not as risky, but as you come closer to the surface, you don't want big jumps, which would, according to Boyle's law, cause rapid expansion of potential bullae. So I don't know whether that's answered the question, but that's how I've read it, and I hope that's answered the question.
Well, I think, Dr. Cronje, once again, there's we don't know what we don't know, as you said, and there's a lot that we most probably going to learn. And for those, Rian, if you want, in the follow-up email tomorrow, in partnership with Dan Europe and Dan America, there are COVID studies, and they come in the form of a survey. So please complete those if you've had COVID. And what happens is we gather all that information. We do regular follow-ups, not just a couple of months, but the study is actually going on for several years, so we can track people that have had COVID and continue to dive, etc., etc. So, just keep a lookout for that. So another question from Tracy Lee. Do you think there should be a change in the operators before dive indemnities? Now, I assume it might be, do you change the indemnity forms? Do you use different indemnity forms? If that's the question, well, I can maybe add something there before I hand over to you, Dr. Cronje. Dan Europe actually did a great job and created a COVID questionnaire over and above the medical or RSTC form, which we've made available to dive operators, around about July, August. And you'll most probably find that in the follow-up email as well. So, Tracy, if that is the question you're asking, click that link tomorrow, and it'll take you to all the forms that Dr. Cronje mentioned, plus this particular form and the new RSTC form, not the old one. But I'll hand over to you, Dr. Cronje.
Yeah, Mona, I can't really add much to what you said. That's absolutely brilliant. And it is essentially a way of determining whether the grade noughts were really grade noughts and the ones were really grade ones. That's what the COVID questionnaire would most likely answer. If you went to the hospital, you would have probably had definitive tests, and they would have probably increased the probability of you having had COVID-19 or not. What I wanted to say about an earlier comment that Mornay said, which is very important, and I want to compare it to the Framingham study. The Framingham study was a study done on a group of people from the place called Framingham, and they monitored various aspects of blood pressure, blood cholesterol, etc., etc. And based on following them up over decades, it eventually led to an algorithm that has now become a way of predicting the chance of having a heart attack if you have a certain cholesterol level, a certain blood pressure, whether you suffer from diabetes, whether you're a smoker or not. So in other words, we will be building the algorithm that will ultimately refine this very crude grading system into something that is a lot more nuanced and definitely more scientific.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Tracy, it'll be great. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you got COVID, and I know that you're an avid diver down Natal's side. So it'll be great. If I think I might have shared the link with you. If not, please keep a lookout. And if you don't find it, you know how to get hold of me, and I'll share that with you again. So thank you for that, Dr. Cronje. We got Linda here. She's asking a question. Is there a difference between scuba diving and free diving? I think we've nailed that answer earlier on with Dirk asking, does it affect free divers? So I don't know if you would like to add anything, or shall we move on to another question, Dr. Cronje?
Just in brief to say that free diving does require a greater energy expenditure. And one of the elements in return to diving was the issue of resilience. So if you are resilient enough and you can expend the energy to do free diving, the chances are that you were not greatly affected.
Okay.
Scuba diving, on the other hand, does not necessarily require that amount of energy expenditure unless there's an emergency or you need to swim against a current and so on. And that's where the 6 METs came from. So the advice will not be the same between scuba and free diving, because you may feel that you can scuba dive in a relaxed fashion, which does not mean that it would necessarily be safer. Follow the grades that we've discussed. Whereas free diving, if you really feel that you're able to do the free diving, then the chances are that it would not be a problem. But I think one should individualize rather than give blanket statements. In medicine in general, we are getting to the stage where we're individualizing people. Genetic testing and all these other tests that are coming out are indicating more and more that you shouldn't lump people together. One should individualize. And I know that tonight, with the 4 grades, we have been lumping people together, but that is simply a pragmatic way of giving us the first inklings of how to get back into the water after COVID-19.
All right, so we still have a number of questions here. I see we're hitting almost a 2-hour mark. So, if you still have questions, add them now. And if we don't get to all of them, I will pass them on to Dr. Cronje, and we can post them via the YouTube comments. So you can always go back, click on the link, and you can see your comment there. Alternatively, you can send me an email on the replay email or link that I'll send tomorrow, and we can engage in that way. Okay, well, here's another question again from Sumari. Should I rather have a nasal swab or antibody test?
Okay, well, that's again getting to the question of the screening test versus the diagnostic test. There may be some practical advantages. And let me use HIV as an example. Nowadays, they actually do the screening and the diagnostic test at the same time. So it's not done separately as it is or might be done with COVID. If the nasal swab was positive, then I think the antibody test would be appropriate. If the nasal swab test was negative, then I don't think it's necessary. That's my opinion. But you're welcome to throw tomatoes or make comments, send them by email if you like. And I'll be happy to ask my other colleagues. It's great that Gary and Evert are also on board and listening to this. And I'll also welcome their comments because it's the first time that we've really addressed this in this way on this forum.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, here's a question, and I guess a bit of a statement too. Is it right that a PCR test can indicate positive a good deal of time later? Okay, I guess going a little bit later. If so, is the raising risk for travel that you may not have COVID anymore by airlines, for example, they won't let you board? So I guess if the test comes back a little bit later, What now? Can you still board? What will the airlines say? And I guess this is part of the challenges, not just the medical fraternities, governments, business, and so, but individuals are facing. It's not. I don't know. You put it quite nicely earlier. Something closer to the old normal as opposed to the new normal. Where do we find that middle? And I think it's still going to be a while before we maybe move towards the old normal. But yeah, these are the challenges, I guess. Especially divers love traveling, Dr. Cronje, and this is now stopping them from doing it because we love exploring, seeing new places, meeting new people. Yeah. Anyways, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, in the background, on another computer of mine, I'm actually recording a workshop that is addressing all these issues about traveling, in this whole setting. The question is, or one of the concerns is, that a blood test may remain positive after you already have recovered. And that is where it becomes very difficult, because 14 days after you have had symptom onset, it's very unlikely for you still to be infective after 14 days unless you were hospitalized and were really very, very sick. So I can't give you a definite answer, but the chances are, the longer it is after those 2 weeks that you were ill, the less likely it is that a positive PCR test indicates that you are putting anybody else at risk.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Dr. Cronje. Here's another interesting question from Khani, and I guess this comes down to the nuts and bolts and money side of things. Is there an insurance in the event of negative reaction to any vaccine? I think that's, I'm not aware of anything like that, but you might know more than me.
Well, all I can say is that it is a prescribed minimum benefit that a life-threatening allergic reaction is something that should be covered under our Constitution and the Health Act. So it's certainly not something that your insurance is likely to exclude. And if not your insurance, I very much doubt that the hospital would be comfortable with you being saddled with a bill as a result, or whoever gave the injection be saddled with a bill due to the complications of the immunotherapy received, and sort of leave you in the lurch. So I would have to predict, although I don't know, there is most likely going to be a form of coverage for the adverse reactions.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess watch this space because more and more people are receiving the vaccines, and we're likely to start seeing cases like this, and hopefully we can have an update webinar and possibly address certain things like this. Anyways, thank you for your answer there, Dr. Cronje. So here's a question from Stephanie. How long should you pause diving after the second shot? Is there a difference whether you free dive, open circuit, closed circuit? I guess we're kind of circling in very similar questions, but I'll hand it over to you.
Again, just to split, the second shot for the prevention of serious COVID versus the second shot for someone who has had COVID. The extent that the COVID affected you, if you did have COVID, is the deciding factor. The shot that you had, the general advice varies, and the various vaccines have recommendations, but it's very rare to have new negative reactions to the vaccine after 3 days. It's extremely, extremely rare. But when in doubt, don't. In other words, if you feel ill, the principle is that you shouldn't go diving. As far as open and closed circuit, um, the amount of positive pressure on the lung with closed circuit is slightly greater than with open circuit, but whether or not this has any bearing on the type of scarring or the lung injuries involved with COVID-19, there is no such study that I'm aware of.
All right. So there are many thank yous and appreciation for the talk. I'm not going to highlight them now for the folks. We can see those in the comments. We're kind of running out of time a little bit. So I'm going to just skip over to some of the comments again from Dr. Boa. I don't know if you'd like to add anything there, Dr. Cronje.
From Dr. Bow, the COVID vaccine is not a live vaccine, so it can't give you COVID. The vaccine does not require one to have a dive examination. So yes, that's correct. In the case that if you haven't had COVID, bearing in mind that the vaccines, they're not all the same. And so, yes, it is generally true, although the case of the adenovirus, the attenuated adenovirus with J&J, I'm not sure that that is entirely true. So, but I'll leave it at that. The most important thing is that the immunotherapy is meant to elicit an immune response, which then offers you protection if you are subsequently exposed to COVID-19 or a different strain of COVID-19. And you should have gone through the process of whatever reactions you had before one should even contemplate diving. And that's if you didn't have COVID-19. If you did, then the recommendations that we gave there, according to the articles or the article we presented tonight, would supervene, and those would determine your return to diving.
All right, great answer. Thank you very much, and thank you for the statement, Dr. Bauer. Yeah, we've got Simari that asked a couple of questions earlier about vaccines and all sorts of things like that. She says she's 60 years old and I like to hedge my bets and get all the shots I should get. So how long after my second shot should I go do a dive medical before diving?
Well, what I would say is rewind and just listen to what we said a few moments ago. Yeah. Obviously, having the best possible protection is very reasonable. And especially if you're over 60, there may be comorbidities that may have a far greater play on whether you're fit to dive as opposed to COVID. So bear that in mind as well. But after that, if you have not had COVID-19 and you've had your second shot and you haven't had any reaction, then there is no specific reason for you to go for a diving medical unless you've marked yes on one of the items on the RSTC form, or you want to have some additional reassurance.
Okay, so Simari, I hope that answers your question. Last question of the evening is from Danny van Sale. He says, I started to exercise about a month after I had COVID and started to have some chest pain. I would fall into grade 1. I guess that's a question. Because I could self-isolate, or do I have to treat it as a grade 2?
Actually, Donnie, you're a beautiful illustration of why this grading system actually is good, because as you may remember, with the grade 1 and the self-isolation and minor symptoms and no need for medical care, what we said was that, sorry, that wasn't the right slide. One more. uh, I'm just trying to find that slide here. Yes, was that you should typically wait 3 months before going back to diving, and that to some extent includes going back to active gymming, because we know of people who have developed some permanent cardiac abnormalities by starting exercising too soon after overcoming their COVID-19. So please take it easy.
All right. So, Donnie, I hope that answers your question. But again, if you have more questions or would like to follow up, just respond to the mail that you'll receive tomorrow, and we can take it further and, discuss any other questions or needs that you might have. So I think we'll wrap it up for this evening. There are a lot of thank yous, so I'm not going to play them now, but thank you so much, everybody that attended. We started off with just over 100. We're at about 50% now, which is great. It's nice to have everybody on board. For those folks that maybe joined after I did my opening sort of welcome and so forth presentation, you might not know that I had a couple of free gifts and available. So let me just show you what it is. Because you've attended the webinar, I'm actually giving away a free Dan guide, and it's Dr. Alan Cale's How to Manage Diving Problems. It's a really great book. I think every diver should have it electronically on their device or printed. Put it in your dive bag. It addresses a range of different diving problems that you might encounter, with loads of checklists and graphs and a whole bunch of things. So if you want, just scan that QR code. That'll take you to the Dan Southern Africa WhatsApp business account, and I pre-populated a message. Say, hi, I'd like the guide that you mentioned. All you need to do is just add your name in there so that I know who I'm talking to. And once I receive the WhatsApp, I will send you the link that you can use to download the guide. So really nice. I would say, if you haven't got it yet, scan it now, send me a message, and keep it on your phone, tablet, computer, or so forth. Now, just to sort of add to a lot of what Dr. Cronje was talking about this evening, is that we started or created a campaign via our website, and it really focuses on returning to diving safely after a period of COVID or isolation, or just, you weren't able to go dive because you were in lockdown. And it addresses a range of different topics, from inactivity, health concerns, fitness, all the things that Dr. Cronje was talking about. But it also digs into sort of risk mitigation. Your gear has been at home for a while. Have you checked it? Does it need a service? And there's really a lot of information. So it'll take you a good couple of days or even weeks, depending on your schedule and time available, to dig through all the content. Great articles, loads of resources to download, etc., etc. So scan that code, and it'll take you to the landing page, and you can work through the content all on your own. So lastly, for the folks that are still here, it'll be great if you can follow us on all our social media platforms. If you scan that code, it takes you to a landing page, and you can it'll give you a sort of a link to our website, as well as all the handles for Dan Southern Africa on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, and most important for this evening is YouTube. So if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, please subscribe. It'll help us grow our channel, get a bigger footprint on the YouTube and Google searches, to help us spread the word and create more dive safety awareness and share all these valuable resources that we have. Now, if you don't know, we share a weekly Dan video. It's sort of dubbed under the diving factoids, and it really, we get these questions via the hotline, and Dr. Cronje then puts it together in a video format to help you better understand what the answers to some of these questions are. They're very short little snippets, so they're not going to keep you busy for hours on end. They vary from 2-3 minutes to the max, say 10, I think 15 minutes at the most. So they're nice, snippy, straight to the point. And if you'd like to get reminded. Remember to hit the little bell icon when you subscribe, and then you'll get notified whenever we have a new video that we're going to be releasing. So from my side, thank you very much for everybody that stuck around right till the end. Dr. Cronje, fantastic presentation, and I guess all we can say is that watch this space. As you said earlier, the article will be released tomorrow, and most probably will challenge a lot what was said this evening. So I think as divers, as what did I call you guys right in the beginning? Dive Nation of the world. We need to have an open mind and not get stuck on one thing is the right thing, because things are changing on a daily basis. And from my side, please be safe. Remember the basics. Wash your hands, mask, sanitize, and spread that message. So from my side, thank you very much for the DAN members and all the people that joined. Thank you for your support. Divers Alert Network is your community of divers and experts willing to share their knowledge with you, and we make that available free for most parts. So that's my side. Thank you. I hope you're going to have a nice evening. Over to you, Dr. Cronje, if you have any parting words.
Well, just to say that it's wonderful that so many people show interest and are actively engaged. And it's not only you that have attended, it's the people that you'll speak to and may draw attention to the resources. So we're relying on you to some extent to be ambassadors of the information and dispelling misinformation and explaining the ambiguity in some of the information that is out there, that is not intended to be malicious, but that it is sometimes just honestly a fact that we don't know and are finding the answers as we go along. So have a good evening and be safe, and we look forward to getting back in the water, all of us. Okay, so that's it from me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening. Thanks for sticking around. Until next week, when I have Gareth Locke all the way from the UK. He's going to talk to us about decision-making and when we don't apply those, how things can go wrong. So that's going to be an interesting topic, and a great speaker. He's doing some great stuff. So keep a lookout. I'll pump a whole bunch of emails out and WhatsApp messages. So keep a lookout for those. From my side, good night and enjoy the rest of your evening.